It was a super hot afternoon, the kind where the sun feels like it's cooking everything. Jake Riley was riding his motorcycle down a quiet road on the edge of town. His motorcycle was loud, really loud, like a bear growling at the sky. Jake wore an old leather jacket that looked beat up and messy, but he liked it that way. Most people in this little town didn't even look at him. To them, he was just a scruffy guy on a bike. "Get a real job," they'd shout from their porches as he zoomed by. But Jake didn't care one bit. He had his motorcycle, the wide open road, and something else, a secret. A big secret nobody knew about yet. Now, Jake wasn't just any guy. Oh no, there was something special about him, something huge that was going to shake up this sleepy town. But right now, nobody had a clue. He was like a shadow, just passing through, minding his own business. The wind blew in his face, and the road stretched out ahead like it went on forever. Everything seemed normal until he heard something. A sharp bark. Then a little yelp. It wasn't a happy sound. It was the sound of trouble, and it made Jake's ears perk up. He slowed his bike down a little, listening hard. What was that? His heart started beating faster. Something was going on, and Jake wasn't the kind of guy to ignore it. Around here, people thought he was just a biker with no cares in the world. They didn't know he was brave. They didn't know he was smart. And they sure didn't know about the secret hiding inside him, waiting to come out. That secret was like a surprise party nobody saw coming, and it was about to make this boring day a lot more exciting. The town was small and quiet, with dusty streets and old houses. People sat on their porches, fanning themselves because of the heat. They watched Jake ride by, but they didn't wave. They didn't smile. To them, he was just some loud guy making noise with his bike. "Go away, Jake," they'd say, shaking their heads. But Jake didn't mind their grumpy words. He liked being free, riding wherever he wanted. His bike was his best friend, and the road was his home. But that bark, that little yelp, changed everything. It came from somewhere up ahead, near an old gas station that looked rusty and forgotten. Jake's eyes narrowed. He didn't know it yet, but his day was about to get wild. Really wild. Trouble was brewing, like a storm getting ready to crash down. And Jake? He was riding right into it. So, what do you think he heard? Was it a dog? Was it something else? Don't go anywhere, because the story is just starting, and it's going to get crazier. Jake's secret is waiting, and when it comes out, you won't believe your eyes. Stick around to find out what happens next. Jake slowed his motorcycle down, the loud growl of it turning into a low rumble. He tilted his head and squinted his eyes, looking down the dusty road. There, right by an old gas station, he saw something that made his stomach twist. It was a police officer, Officer Dan Tucker. Dan was a big guy, tall and wide, with a loud voice that could scare anyone. He wore a shiny badge on his chest, and he loved showing it off, like it made him the king of the town. Everyone knew Dan. He liked to boss people around, especially when he thought no one was watching him. And right now, he was being mean, really mean, to a little dog. The dog was a German Shepherd, a scrappy one with fur that looked messy and a leg that didn't work quite right. It had a limp, but it was still barking loud, like its life depended on it. Woof. Woof, it went, standing its ground even though it was scared. Dan's face was red, and his eyes were angry. "Shut up, mutt," he yelled, his voice booming across the empty road. Then he did something awful. He lifted his big, heavy boot, like he was going to kick that poor dog right in the side. The dog whimpered, a sad little sound, but it didn't run away. It just kept barking, softer now, like it was trying to be brave. Jake's hands tightened on his handlebars. He could feel them squeezing hard, his knuckles turning white. He didn't like bullies. Never had, not even when he was a kid. Back then, if someone picked on him or his friends, he'd stand up and say, "Stop it." And now, seeing Dan tower over that little dog made something hot and mad bubble up inside him. People in town thought Jake was just a drifter, a guy with no home, no job, just a loud motorcycle and a dirty jacket. They'd laugh and say, "Jake's nobody special." But they were wrong. Dan was about to find out just how wrong they were. The gas station was old and rusty, with peeling paint and a sign that creaked in the wind. No one was around, no cars, no people, just Dan and the dog and Jake watching from his bike. The sun was blazing down, making everything feel sticky and hot. Dan didn't even notice Jake at first. He was too busy yelling at the dog, his big hands waving in the air. "You're nothing but trouble," he shouted. "I ought to teach you a lesson." The dog's ears went back, and its tail tucked under, but it still didn't run. It was like it was saying, "I'm not scared of you," even though its little body was shaking. Jake took a deep breath. He could feel something stirring inside him, like a fire waking up. It wasn't just anger, it was something bigger, something fierce. He didn't know everything about that dog yet, but he knew one thing: it didn't deserve this. Nobody did. Dan thought he could do whatever he wanted because of that shiny badge. He thought he was tough, picking on something smaller than him. But Jake wasn't going to let it happen. Not today. Not ever. The road was quiet now, except for Dan's yelling and the dog's barking. Jake's motorcycle sat still, its engine rumbling soft and low. He stared at Dan, watching every move the big man made. Dan's boot was still up in the air, hovering like he couldn't decide whether to kick or not. The dog looked up at him with big, brown eyes that were scared but strong. Jake's heart thumped loud in his chest. He hated seeing anyone get hurt, especially something that couldn't fight back. Dan finally put his boot down, but he didn't stop being mean. "Stupid mutt," he grumbled, crossing his arms. "You don't belong here. Nobody wants you." His words were sharp, like little darts aimed at the dog. Jake's jaw got tight. He didn't like how Dan talked like he owned everything, like he could decide who mattered and who didn't. Around town, Dan was famous for being loud and bossy. He'd stop people for no reason, just to show off. "I'm in charge," he'd say, puffing out his chest. Most folks were too afraid to argue with him. But Jake? He wasn't afraid. Not one bit. The dog barked again, a little weaker this time. Its bad leg wobbled, and it looked like it might fall over. Jake's eyes narrowed. Something about that dog felt different. Like it wasn't just any stray. But he couldn't figure it out yet. All he knew was that Dan was being a bully, and bullies didn't scare Jake. They made him mad. They made him want to do something. Dan turned his head a little and finally saw Jake sitting there on his bike. His eyes got small and mean. "What are you looking at?" he snapped, pointing a finger at Jake. "This ain't your business, biker. Keep moving." His voice was loud, like he wanted the whole world to hear him. But Jake didn't flinch. He didn't move. He just sat there, quiet and still, watching. The air felt heavy now, like something big was about to happen. The dog stopped barking and looked at Jake, its head tilting a little. It was like it was asking for help without saying a word. Jake's hands stayed tight on his handlebars. He could feel that fierce thing inside him growing stronger, pushing him to act. Dan thought he was just some guy on a bike, a nobody. But Jake wasn't a nobody. He was someone who cared, someone who wouldn't let a bully win. Dan took a step toward the dog again, his boots scraping the ground. "I said shut up," he yelled, louder this time. The dog whimpered again, and that was it. Jake couldn't take it anymore. Something snapped inside him, like a rubber band breaking. He wasn't going to sit back and watch. Not today. Dan was about to learn that Jake wasn't the kind of guy who stayed quiet when things got tough. Trouble was here, and Jake was ready to face it head on. What would he do next? "You'll see, it's going to be big." Jake pulled his motorcycle over to the side of the road. The engine growled one last time before going quiet. He swung his leg off the bike, and his boots hit the gravel with a loud crunch. He stood tall, looking right at Officer Dan and that poor little dog. "Hey!" Jake called out. His voice was steady, like a rock, but sharp enough to cut through the hot, sticky air. Officer Dan spun around fast, his eyes squinting into an angry glare. "Mind your own business, biker," he spat, his words mean and loud. He pointed at the scrappy German shepherd with the wobbly leg. "This mutt's a stray, probably dangerous. I'm handling it." Dan's chest was all puffed up, like he wanted everyone to see how big and tough he was. His shiny badge gleamed in the sunlight, and his voice sounded like he thought he owned the whole world. Jake didn't say anything right away. He just tilted his head a little, looking at the dog. It didn't look dangerous to him. Its fur was messy, and its eyes were big and scared. It was barking before, but now it was just standing there, shaking a little on its bad leg. Jake frowned. Something about that dog felt different. Like maybe he'd seen it before. He wasn't sure yet, but he knew one thing: it didn't deserve Dan yelling at it like that. Jake took a step closer, his boots crunching again in the gravel. Dan's face got even madder. "I said mind your business," he shouted, waving his hand like he could shoo Jake away. "Get back on your stupid bike and go." But Jake didn't listen. He ignored Dan's loud threats and that puffed up chest. "Doesn't look like a stray to me," Jake said, keeping his voice low and calm. It was quiet, but it had power, like a whisper that makes you stop and listen. Dan laughed, but it wasn't a nice laugh. It was mean and ugly, like a bully making fun of someone smaller. "What are you, some dog whisperer?" he said, his voice dripping with nastiness. "Get lost before I make you." He took a big step toward Jake, like he was trying to scare him off. His hands were fists now, and his face was turning redder by the second. He thought Jake would run away. He thought Jake was just some biker with no guts. Boy, was he wrong. But Jake didn't budge. He didn't even blink. He just stood there, steady as a tree, and then he did something Dan didn't expect. He crouched down, right there in the gravel, and held out his hand to the dog. His fingers were open, gentle, like he was saying, "It's okay, I'm here." And here's the crazy part: the dog stopped barking. It went quiet, like someone flipped a switch. Then, slow and wobbly, it limped over to Jake. Its bad leg dragged a little, but it didn't stop. When it got close, it sniffed Jake's hand and then it licked his fingers. Jake's eyes got wide for a second. That lick, it felt like the dog knew him. Like they were old friends or something. He didn't know how or why yet, but his heart started beating faster. Something was clicking in his head, like a puzzle piece falling into place. The dog's big brown eyes looked up at him, soft and trusting, and Jake felt that fierce thing inside him grow even more. He wasn't just mad at Dan anymore. He was starting to wonder about this dog. Who was it? Why did it feel so familiar? Dan's face turned as red as a tomato. "You think you're tough, huh?" he growled, stepping closer to Jake. His boots stomped hard on the ground, kicking up little clouds of dust. "You think you can just walk up here and act all big? I'll show you who's boss." He puffed his chest out even more, like a balloon about to pop. He was so mad, he didn't even notice how the dog was wagging its tail a tiny bit now, looking at Jake like he was its hero. Jake stood up slow, brushing the gravel off his hands. He looked at Dan, calm and cool, even though Dan was yelling and stomping. "I don't think it's dangerous," Jake said, nodding at the dog. "I think it's just scared." His voice was still low, but it had a little edge now, like he was warning Dan to back off. The dog sat down next to Jake's boots, its bad leg sticking out funny. It wasn't shaking anymore. It was like Jake being there made it feel safe. Dan laughed again, that same mean laugh. "Oh, you're a real softy, huh?" he said, rolling his eyes. "You and your little pet. Get out of here before I lock you both up." He reached for something on his belt, maybe his baton or his handcuffs. He wanted Jake to be scared. He wanted Jake to run. But Jake didn't move. He just stood there, looking at Dan, then back at the dog. That's when Jake started to feel it, something big was hiding inside him. A secret. A story. He didn't know all of it yet, but little bits were starting to peek out, like sunshine through the clouds. The way the dog licked his hand, the way it looked at him, it wasn't just random. There was something more. Something Dan didn't know about. Something that was going to turn this whole day upside down. Dan kept talking, his voice loud and grumpy. "I'm the law here, biker. You don't tell me what to do." He pointed at the dog again. "That thing's a stray, and I'm getting rid of it." But Jake wasn't listening to Dan's noise. He was thinking about the dog. Those eyes. That limp. It was like a memory tickling the back of his brain, trying to get out. He didn't have all the answers yet, but he knew one thing: he wasn't leaving that dog with Dan. No way. The air felt thick now, like a storm was coming. Dan was still yelling, still acting tough, but Jake was calm. Too calm. Little did Dan know, Jake wasn't just some guy on a bike. He was hiding something huge. And every second that passed, every bark from that dog, every mean word from Dan, was bringing that secret closer to the surface. What was it? You're gonna find out soon, and trust me, it's going to be wild. The air felt heavy, like it was pressing down on everything. It was so thick with tension you could almost touch it. Officer Dan's face was red and sweaty, and his hand moved fast to his belt. He grabbed his baton, a big, black stick he used to scare people, and held it up high. He was ready to swing it, ready to show Jake who was boss. His eyes were mean, and his chest was puffed out like always. He thought he could make Jake back down. He thought he was the toughest guy around. But he was about to find out he was wrong, really wrong. Jake didn't flinch. He didn't run. He just stood up, slow and calm, like nothing in the world could scare him. His boots crunched one last time in the gravel as he straightened up. Then he reached up to his face and pulled off his sunglasses. The sunlight hit his eyes, and they looked strong and steady. That's when Dan froze. His hand stopped in the air, still holding the baton. His mouth opened a little, and his eyes got big. "Wait a minute," he stammered, his voice shaky now. He squinted at Jake, like he was trying to figure out a puzzle. You're that guy." Dan's tough look started to melt away. He didn't look so big anymore. See, Jake wasn't just a biker with a loud motorcycle and a messy jacket. Oh no, he was way more than that. He was Jake Riley, and years ago, he was one of the best dog trainers in the whole state police. He worked with canine dogs, the kind that help cops catch bad guys, find lost stuff, and even save people. Jake was amazing at it. He taught those dogs how to sniff out trouble, how to be brave, and how to take down anyone who was up to no good. Everyone said he was the best there ever was. But then, a long time ago, he left that job. He stopped training dogs and disappeared. People thought he was done with that life, but they didn't know the whole story. And that dog, the scrappy German Shepherd with the limp. It wasn't just some stray like Dan said. It was Titan. Yep, Titan. That little dog used to be one of Jake's partners back in the police days. They worked together, side by side, sniffing out clues and chasing down trouble. Titan was brave and smart, just like Jake taught him to be. But when Titan got older and his leg got hurt, the police didn't want him anymore. They retired him, kicked him out, and left him all alone. Poor Titan ended up wandering around, forgotten by everyone, except Jake. The second Jake saw those big, soulful eyes, he knew. He knew it was Titan. That's why the dog licked his hand. That's why it stopped barking and limped over to him. It remembered Jake, even after all those years. Jake's heart jumped when he saw Titan, because deep down, he never forgot his old friend either. They were a team once, and now here they were, together again, right when Titan needed help the most. Jake took a step forward, his eyes locked on Dan. "I don't think you're the one giving orders here," he said. His voice wasn't loud or shouty anymore. It was hard, like steel, strong and unbreakable. He pointed at Titan, who was sitting by his boots now, looking up at him with those trusting eyes. "Titan's coming with me," Jake said. "And you? You're done messing with him or anyone else?" Dan's jaw dropped. It just fell open, like he couldn't believe what he was hearing. The big, tough cop who loved to yell and boss people around. He didn't look tough anymore. He looked small, like a kid who got caught doing something bad. His baton slipped a little in his hand, and his shoulders slumped. He stared at Jake, then at Titan, then back at Jake again. You can't do that," he sputtered, but his voice wasn't loud now. It was weak, like he wasn't so sure of himself anymore. Jake didn't even blink. He stood tall, his messy jacket flapping a little in the wind. The sun was shining behind him, making him look big and strong like a hero in a movie. Titan wagged his tail a tiny bit, his bad legs sticking out funny. He wasn't scared anymore, not with Jake there. Dan's shiny badge didn't mean anything now. All his yelling and stomping didn't matter. Jake wasn't just some biker. He was someone who knew dogs, someone who cared, someone who wouldn't let a bully win. Dan took a step back, his boots scraping the ground. "You're Jake Riley," he said, his voice all wobbly. He'd heard the name before. Everyone in the police world had. Jake Riley, the guy who trained the best canine dogs ever. The guy who could teach a dog to do anything. Dan's face went pale, like all the red drained right out of it. He didn't know what to say. He didn't know what to do. For the first time, he wasn't the boss. Jake was. The air wasn't thick anymore. It felt clear, like a big storm had just passed. Jake looked down at Titan and smiled a little, just a tiny curve of his mouth. "Hey, old buddy," he said softly, so only the dog could hear. Titan's ears perked up, and he let out a quiet woof, like he was saying, "Hey, I missed you." It was a big moment, a huge surprise. Dan thought he was picking on a nobody and a stray, but he was wrong. Jake wasn't a nobody, and Titan wasn't a stray. They were a team that was back together, ready to stand up to anyone. Dan's hand dropped to his side, the baton hanging loose. He didn't look like a big, tough cop now. He looked like a guy who just lost a fight he didn't even know he was in. Jake stepped closer, his voice still hard like steel. "You don't touch him," he said, pointing at Titan. "Not now. Not ever." "And Dan?" He didn't argue. He couldn't. The truth was out, and it was bigger than he could handle. Jake's secret was free, and it changed everything. The next day came fast, and boy, did things change. Word spread like wildfire all over town. People couldn't stop talking about what happened by that old gas station. Everyone was buzzing, whispering to each other on porches, in stores, and even by the mailbox. "Did you hear about Jake and Officer Dan?" they'd say, their eyes big and excited. Turns out, Officer Dan wasn't such a nice guy after all. He had a bad habit, a really bad one. He liked pushing people around, yelling at them, and making them feel small. And it wasn't just people, he was mean to animals too, like poor little Titan. But Jake? Oh, Jake wasn't going to let that happen anymore. Not on his watch. Jake wasn't the kind of guy to sit back and do nothing. He had Titan by his side now, and together they were unstoppable. The very next morning, Jake put on his beat-up leather jacket, patted Titan on the head, and marched straight to the police station. His boots thudded on the ground, and Titan limped along next to him, tail wagging a little even with his bad leg. Jake wasn't scared, not one bit. He walked right through the doors, up to the desk, and told the lady there, "I need to talk to the chief. Right now." His voice was calm but strong, like he meant business. The chief was a big man with a serious face. He listened as Jake told him everything: how Dan yelled at Titan, how he almost kicked him, and how he tried to scare Jake with his baton. Jake didn't leave out a single thing. "Dan's a bully," Jake said, looking the chief right in the eye. "He's been mean to lots of people, and I've got proof." He filed a report, a paper that told the whole story, and handed it over. Titan sat next to him, looking up at the chief like he was saying, "Yep, it's all true." The chief wasn't happy. Not at all. His eyebrows went down, and his mouth turned into a straight line. He didn't like hearing that one of his officers was acting so bad. "This isn't okay," he said, his voice deep and grumbly. "We don't let bullies wear badges around here." Everyone in town knew Dan's badge was in trouble now. That shiny thing he loved to flash around. It might not be his for much longer. People started saying, "Dan's gonna lose his job, and good riddance." The chief promised to look into it, and Jake knew justice was coming. Dan couldn't push anyone around anymore, not after this. While all that was happening, Jake took care of Titan. That little dog's leg was still wobbly, but Jake knew just what to do. Back when he trained canine dogs for the police, he learned some tricks, special ways to help dogs feel better. He sat down with Titan in the shade, pulled out a little bag of stuff, and got to work. He rubbed Titan's leg gently, wrapped it with a soft bandage, and even gave him a treat. "You're gonna be okay, buddy," Jake said, smiling. Titan licked his hand, his big eyes all happy and bright. It didn't take long for Titan to start feeling better. Soon, he was trotting around behind Jake, his tail wagging like a flag in the wind. He still limped a tiny bit, but he didn't care. He was too happy to be with Jake again. They walked through town together, Jake on his feet and Titan right by his side. People watched them go by, and something funny happened. The same folks who used to sneer at Jake, who used to yell, "Get a real job, or go away, biker." They weren't sneering anymore. Nope. Now they nodded at him. Some even waved. "Look, that's the guy who stood up to Dan," they'd whisper to each other. "He saved that dog." Kids pointed and smiled, and old ladies on porches clapped their hands. Jake didn't expect that. He didn't chase after respect he never had. He just wanted to do what was right. But now, respect found him anyway. It was like the town was seeing him for the first time, and they liked what they saw. Jake's a good guy, they said. He's tough and kind. And Jake? He just kept walking, his head high, with Titan trotting along like his little shadow. As for Titan, he was the happiest of all. That little dog had been alone for so long, wandering around with no one to love him. The police didn't want him anymore, and he'd been scared and lost. But now he had Jake, his old friend, his hero. Titan didn't have to be afraid anymore. He didn't have to limp around all by himself. He had a home now, right next to Jake. Every time Jake looked down at him, Titan wagged his tail so hard it looked like it might fly off. "You're my buddy," Jake would say, and Titan would bark a little woof, like he was saying, "You're my buddy too." By the end of the day, things felt different in town. Dan wasn't out yelling at people anymore, he was too busy trying to save his batch. The chief was still mad, and everyone knew Dan was in big trouble. Maybe he'd learn his lesson, or maybe he'd just grumble and stomp away. Either way, he couldn't hurt Titan or anyone else now. Jake made sure of that. The town felt safer, like a big bully had finally been told, no more. Jake and Titan sat together outside as the sun started to go down. The sky turned orange and pink, and the air got cooler. People walked by, smiling at them, and Jake gave a little nod back. He didn't need a big thank you or a parade. He just needed Titan, and Titan just needed him. Justice was served not with yelling or fighting, but with truth and kindness. Dan's mean days were over, and Jake's good days were just beginning. The town wouldn't forget this, not ever. And neither would Titan, who finally had his hero back for good. The sun was going down, turning the sky all orange and pink, like a big, pretty painting. Jake climbed onto his motorcycle that evening, ready to ride off into the cool air. But he wasn't alone this time. Nope. Titan, his scrappy little German Shepherd buddy, was with him. Jake had made something special, a sidecar, just for Titan. It was a little box on the side of his bike, rigged up with some old stuff he found. He strapped it on tight so Titan could ride along. Titan hopped in, his tail wagging like crazy, even with his wobbly legs sticking out a bit. Jake looked at him and smiled, really smiled for the first time in a long, long time. Then he turned the key, and the motorcycle roared to life, loud as a bear waking up from a nap. Off they went, zooming down the road together, the wind blowing in their faces. As they rode, the town got smaller behind them. The houses, the gas station, the police station, all of it faded away. The sunset made everything glow, and Jake felt something warm inside his chest. It wasn't just the wind or the roar of his bike. It was something bigger. See, Jake didn't look like much to most people. His jacket was old and messy, his bike was loud, and folks thought he was just some guy with nothing special going on. "Get a real job," they'd yell. But they were so wrong. Jake had everything that mattered: guts, heart, and a loyal friend. He didn't need fancy stuff or a big house. He had Titan, and Titan had him, and that was enough. The road stretched out ahead, long and twisty, like it could take them anywhere. Titan's ears flapped in the breeze, and he looked up at Jake with those big, happy eyes. Jake kept one hand on the handlebars and reached over with the other to pat Titan's head. "You're my buddy," he said, his voice soft but strong. Titan barked a little woof, back, like he was saying, "You're my buddy too." They didn't need a lot of words. They just understood each other, the way best friends do. Now, let's think about something for a minute. All this stuff that happened, the yelling, the barking, the big surprise about Jake being a dog trainer, it's over now. Dan got in trouble, Titan got a home, and Jake got respect. But there's more to it than just a fun story. It makes you wonder, who's the real hero in your life? Is it the loud one, the one who's always barking orders, telling everyone what to do? Like Officer Dan, with his shiny badge and his big voice? Or is it the quiet one, the one who doesn't say much but steps up when it really counts? Like Jake, who looked like he had nothing but turned out to have everything that matters. Think about that for a second. Maybe you know someone loud, a teacher who yells, a kid who brags, or even a grown-up who acts like they're the boss of everything. They might seem big and important, like they're in charge. But then there's the quiet ones. The kid who helps you when you drop your books. The friend who shares their snack without making a fuss. The person who stands up for what's right, even when no one else does. Those are the ones who sneak up on you. They don't need to shout. They just do what's good, and that makes them heroes. Jake was like that. He didn't walk around town saying, "Hey, I'm a big deal." He didn't need to. He just saw Titan in trouble and said, "Nope, not today." He used his guts to stand up to Dan. He used his heart to take care of his old friend. And Titan? He stayed loyal, even when he was scared and alone. Together, they showed everyone that you don't need to be loud or fancy to be strong. You just need to care and then do something about it. The sky got darker as Jake and Titan rode on, the orange turning to purple and then to night. Stars started popping out, little twinkly lights all over. The road was quiet now, just the sound of the motorcycle humming along. Jake didn't know where they were going, not exactly. But that was okay. He didn't need a map or a plan. He had Titan, and Titan had him, and the road was wide open. Maybe they'd find a new town. Maybe they'd camp under the stars. Whatever happened, they'd be together, and that made everything feel right. So here's something for you to think about: who's your hero? Who's the one in your life who's got the guts and the heart, even if they don't show off about it? Maybe it's your mom or dad, who works hard and still helps you with homework. Maybe it's a teacher who listens when you're sad. Maybe it's your best friend, who sticks by you no matter what. Or maybe, just maybe, it's you. Yeah, you. Have you ever done something brave, even if it was small? Like helping a friend or standing up for what's right? That's hero stuff right there. Let's talk about it. Tell me below, who's the real hero in your life? Is it the loud one barking orders, or the quiet one who steps up when it counts? I want to know what you think. And while you're at it, tell me where you're watching from. Are you in a big city with tall buildings? A little town with dusty roads? Somewhere with trees and birds? Drop it in the comments, I love hearing from you. Jake and Titan kept riding, the night wrapping around them like a big, cozy blanket. The motorcycle's rumble was like a song, and Titan's happy tail was the beat. Jake didn't need the town to cheer for him. He didn't need Dan to say sorry. He had what he needed right there in that sidecar, a friend who'd never leave him. And Titan? He had his hero back, the one who saved him from being alone. Life's funny like that. Sometimes the people who look like they've got nothing are the ones with the most. Jake didn't have a big house or a shiny car. He didn't have a fancy job or lots of money. But he had guts. He had heart. He had Titan. And that's worth more than anything you can buy. It's the stuff that makes you strong, even when the world tries to push you down. So keep your eyes open, okay? Watch the people around you. The loud ones might catch your attention first, but the quiet ones, they're the ones to look out for. They're the ones who surprise you, who show up when you need them, who make things better without even trying hard. Jake was that guy. Titan was that dog. And maybe you've got someone like that too, or maybe you are that someone. Until next time, keep your eyes on the road. You never know what's coming around the bend. Maybe it's a friend. Maybe it's a chance to be brave. Maybe it's a story waiting to happen. Wherever you go, take your guts and your heart with you, just like Jake did. And if you've got a loyal buddy by your side, even better. Ride on, and I'll see you soon with another story to tell.